On the clear and sunny morning of June 27th, the air carried the warmth typical of midsummer. The vibrant blossoms and lush green grass added to the picturesque scene. Around 10 o'clock, the villagers gathered in the square, positioned between the post office and the bank. Unlike some towns where the lottery spanned 2 days and commenced on June 26th due to the large crowds, this village, with its modest population of about 300 people, completed the entire process in just 2 hours. This allowed the lottery to begin at 10 in the morning, ensuring everyone could return home in time for noon dinner. As is customary, the children were the first to assemble. Having recently been released from school for the summer, they initially huddled together, still adjusting to the newfound freedom. Their conversations centered around classrooms, teachers, books, and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already filled his pockets with stones, a trend that quickly caught on with the other boys, each carefully selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby, Harry Jones, and Dickie Delacroix amassed a substantial pile of stones in one corner of the square, fiercely guarding it against other boys' attempts to pilfer. Meanwhile, the girls stood apart, engaged in their own conversations, occasionally glancing over their shoulders at the boys. The younger children amused themselves by rolling in the dust or holding onto the hands of their older siblings. Gradually, the men began to gather, discussing matters such as planting, rain, tractors, and taxes. They stood away from the stone pile, sharing quiet jokes with smiles rather than boisterous laughter. The women, clad in faded house dresses and sweaters, arrived shortly after their husbands, exchanging greetings and snippets of gossip as they joined them. Eventually, the women called for their children, who responded reluctantly after being called several times. Even when Bobby Martin evaded his mother's grasp and returned to the stone pile laughing, his father's stern reprimand prompted him to quickly take his place between his father and oldest brother. Mr. Summers, the man responsible for various civic activities in the village, including the lottery, square dances, teenage club, and Halloween programs, conducted the lottery. A round-faced, genial man who managed the coal business, Mr. Summers garnered sympathy from the villagers because he had no children and a scolding wife. As he arrived in the square carrying the black wooden box, a murmur of conversation arose. Waving and calling out, "Little late today, folks." Mr. Summers was followed by the postmaster, Mr. Graves, who carried a three-legged stool. Placing the stool in the center of the square, Mr. Summers set the black box upon it. The villagers maintained a respectful distance, creating a space between themselves and the stool. When Mr. Summers asked for assistance, there was a brief hesitation before two men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, stepped forward to hold the box steady on the stool while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside. The original tools used for the lottery had been lost over time, and the black box now resting on the stool had been in use long before Old Man Warner, the town's eldest resident, was born. Despite Mr. Summers frequently suggesting the creation of a new box, the villagers were hesitant to disrupt the long-standing tradition embodied by the black box. There was a tale circulating that the current box had been crafted using remnants from its predecessor, the one fashioned when the village was first established. Each year, after the lottery, Mr. Summers would bring up the idea of a new box, only for the topic to gradually fade without any action being taken. The black box deteriorated annually, losing its complete blackness, displaying splinters along one side, revealing the original wood color, and bearing fading or stains in some areas. Mr. Martin and his eldest son, Baxter, held the black box securely on the stool, while Mr. Summers thoroughly stirred the papers with his hand. Due to the forgetting or abandonment of much of the ritual, Mr. Summers successfully introduced slips of paper to replace the traditional wood chips used for generations. He argued that wood chips were suitable when the village was small, but with a population exceeding 300 and likely to grow, using something that would easily fit into the black box became necessary. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves prepared the slips of paper, placed them in the box, and then secured the box in the safe at Mr. Summers' coal company until it was time to bring it to the square the next morning. Throughout the rest of the year, the box was stored in various locations, spending time in Mr. Graves's barn, underfoot in the post office, or on a shelf in the Martin grocery. Before Mr. Summers officially commenced the lottery, there was a flurry of preparations. Lists were made, including heads of families and members in each household. Mr. Summers was sworn in by the postmaster as the lottery's official, a ritual that had evolved over time. Previously, there was a recital and a ritual salute, but these elements had been abandoned. Mr. Summers, in his clean white shirt and blue jeans, exuded an air of propriety and importance as he conversed at length with Mr. Graves and the Martins. As Mr. Summers concluded his talk and turned towards the gathered villagers, Mrs. Hutchinson hurriedly joined the assembly, her sweater draped over her shoulders. She slipped into the back of the crude, explaining to Mrs. Delacroix that she had forgotten what day it was. They shared a soft laugh, and Mrs. Hutchinson continued, revealing that she thought her husband was outside stacking wood until she noticed the kids were gone. Suddenly, remembering it was the 27th, she rushed to the square. Drying her hands on her apron, she remarked to Mrs. Delacroix, "You're in time, though. They're still talking away up there." Mrs. Hutchinson craned her neck to spot her husband and children standing near the front. Tapping Mrs. Delacroix on the arm in farewell, she began to weave through the crowd. Good-naturedly, people parted to let her through, with a few comments audible across the gathering, such as, "Here comes your Mrs. Hutchinson, and Bill, she made it after all." Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who had been waiting, cheerfully remarked, "Thought we were going to have to get on without you, Tessie." Grinning, Mrs. Hutchinson replied, "Wouldn't have me leave my dishes in the sink now, would you, Joe?" Laughter rippled through the crowd as they resettled after her arrival. Mr. Summers then turned more somberly, stating, "Well now, guess we better get started, get this over with, so's we can go back to work. Anybody ain't here?" Several voices called out, "Dunbar, Dunbar." Consulting his list, Mr. Summers confirmed, "Clyde Dunbar. He's broke his leg, hasn't he? Who's drawing for him?" A woman volunteered. "Me, I guess." Mr. Summers, maintaining formality, asked, "Wife draws for her husband. Don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janie?" Mrs. Dunbar regretfully replied, "Horace is not but 16 yet. Guess I gotta fill in for the old man this year." Mr. Summers noted it on his list, and then inquired, "Watson boy drawing this year?" A tall boy in the crowd, nervously blinking, raised his hand. "Here, I'm drawing for my mother and me." The crowd praised him with comments like, "Good fellow, Jack, and glad to see your mother's got a man to do it." Confirming everyone's presence, Mr. Summers asked, "Old man Warner make it?" A voice responded, "Here," and Mr. Summers nodded. A sudden hush enveloped the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and checked the list. "All ready?" he called. "Now, I'll read the names, heads of families first, and the men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone has had a turn. Everything clear?" Though they had heard the instructions many times, the people only half listened. Most were quiet, wetting their lips and avoiding eye contact. Mr. Summers raised his hand and called out, "Adams!" A man, Steve Adams, separated himself from the crowd and approached. "Hi, Steve," Mr. Summers greeted, and Mr. Adams replied, "Hi, Joe." They exchanged humorless, nervous grins. Mr. Adams reached into the black box, took out a folded paper, and returned to his place in the crowd, standing a little apart from his family. "Alan," Mr. Summers continued, "Anderson, Bentham." In the back row, Mrs. Delacroix remarked to Mrs. Graves, "Seems like there's no time at all between lotteries anymore. Seems like we got through with the last one only last week." "Time sure goes fast," Mrs. Graves concurred. "There goes my old man," Mrs. Delacroix said, holding her breath as her husband went forward. "Dunbar," Mr. Summers announced, and Mrs. Dunbar calmly approached the box, encouraged by the voices of the women saying, "Go on, Janie," and "There she goes." "We're next," Mrs. Graves remarked. She observed as Mr. Graves stepped around the box, greeted Mr. Summers solemnly, and drew a slip of paper from the box. Throughout the crowd, men nervously held the small folded papers in their large hands, turning them over and over. Mrs. Dunbar stood with her two sons clutching the slip of paper. Harbert. Hutchinson. "Get up there, Bill," Mrs. Hutchinson urged, and those around her laughed. "Jones. They say," Mr. Adams commented to old man Warner standing beside him, "over in the North Village they're talking of giving up the lottery." Old man Warner snorted. "Pack of crazy fools," he said. "Listening to the young folks, nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves. Nobody work anymore. Live that way for a while. Used to be a saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery, he added petulantly. Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody. Some places have already quit lotteries, Mrs. Adams said. Nothing but trouble in that, Old Man Warner asserted stoutly. Pack of young fools. Martin. Bobby Martin watched his father go forward. Overdyke, Percy. I wish they'd hurry, Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. I wish they'd hurry. They're almost through, her son reassured her. You get ready to run tell Dad, Mrs. Dunbar instructed. Mr. Summers called his own name, and then stepped forward precisely, selecting a slip from the box. Then he called, Warner. 77th year I've been in the lottery, Old Man Warner declared as he went through the crowd. 77th time, Watson. The tall boy came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said, Don't be nervous, Jack, and Mr. Summers said, Take your time, son. Zanini. After that, there was a long, breathless pause until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, All right, fellows. For a minute, no one moved, and then all the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, asking, Who is it? Who's got it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons? Then the voices began to say, It's Hutchinson, it's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it. Go tell your father, Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. People began to look around to find the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson stood quietly, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, You didn't give him time enough to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair. Be a good sport, Tessie, Mrs. Delacroix called, and Mrs. Graves said, All of us took the same chance. Shut up, Tessie, Bill Hutchinson said. Well, everyone, Mr. Summers said. That was done pretty fast, and now we've got to be hurrying a little more to get done in time. He consulted his next list. Bill, he said, you draw for the Hutchinson family. You got any other households in the Hutchinsons? There's Don and Eva, Mrs. Hutchinson yelled. Make them take their chance. Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie, Mr. Summers said gently. You know that as well as anyone else. It wasn't fair, Tessie said. I guess not, Joe, Bill Hutchinson said regretfully. My daughter draws with her husband's family. That's only fair, and I've got no other family except the kids. Then, as far as drawing for families is concerned, it's you, Mr. Summers said in explanation. And as far as drawing for households is concerned, that's you too, right? Right, Bill Hutchinson said. How many kids, Bill? Mr. Summers asked formally. 3, Bill Hutchinson said. There's Bill Jr. and Nancy and little Dave, and Tessie and me. All right then, Mr. Summers said. Harry, you got their tickets back? Mr. Graves nodded and held up the slips of paper. Put them in the box then, Mr. Summers directed. Take Bill's and put it in. I think we ought to start over, Mrs. Hutchinson said, as quietly as she could. I tell you it wasn't fair. You didn't give him time enough to choose. Everybody saw that. Mr. Graves had selected the 5 slips and put them in the box, and he dropped all the papers but those onto the ground, where the breeze caught them and lifted them off. Listen, everybody, Mrs. Hutchinson was saying to the people around her. Ready, Bill? Mr. Summers asked, and Bill Hutchinson, with one quick glance around at his wife and children, nodded. Remember, Mr. Summers said, take the slips and keep them folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you help little Dave. Mr. Graves took the hand of the little boy, who came willingly with him up to the box. Take a paper out of the box, Davy, Mr. Summers said. Davy put his hand into the box and laughed. Take just one paper, Mr. Summers said. Harry, you hold it for him. Mr. Graves took the child's hand and removed the folded paper from the tight fist and held it, while little Dave stood next to him and looked up at him wonderingly. Nancy next, Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12, and her school friends breathed heavily as she went forward, switching her skirt, and took a slip daintily from the box. Bill Jr., Mr. Summers said, and Billy, his face red and his feet overlarge, nearly knocked the box over as he got a paper out. Tessie, Mr. Summers said. She hesitated for a minute, looking around defiantly, and then set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched a paper out and held it behind her. Bill, Mr. Summers said, and Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out at last with the slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered, I hope it's not Nancy. and the sound of the whisper reached the edges of the crowd. "It's not the way it used to be," Old Man Warner said clearly. "People ain't the way they used to be." "All right," Mr. Summers said. "Open the papers. Harry, you open little Dave's." Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see that it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time, and both beamed and laughed, turning around to the crowd and holding their slips of paper above their heads. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, and then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank. "It's Tessie," Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. "Show us her paper, Bill." Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it, the black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with the heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. "All right, folks," Mr. Summers said. "Let's finish quickly." Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Mrs. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she said. "Hurry up." Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, "I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead and I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers with Mrs. Graves beside him. "It isn't fair, it isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her.